For how long have communicators been talking about the right way to handle a layoff? It can probably be counted in decades. And if anybody should get it right, it's a company that handles communication for a living. But if the Omnicom layoffs are any indication, leaders still get it horribly wrong, as we'll explain in this short midweek episode of For Immediate Release.
Another fine podcast from the FIR Podcast Network.
This is For Immediate Release, the podcast for communicators.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode number 492 of For Immediate Release. I'm Shel Holtz.
And I'm Neville Hobson. In this episode, we're going to talk about something that's been playing out very publicly over the past few weeks in our own industry, i.e. communication. It's about Omnicom, its merger with IPG, and the layoffs that followed. Following confirmation of the $13.5 billion merger, the company announced that around 4,000 roles would be cut, with many of those job losses happening before Christmas. On the face of it, this is not unusual. Mergers of this scale inevitably create overlap, and redundancies are part of that reality. What makes this different was not simply the decision, but how the story unfolded and where. On one level, there was the official corporate narrative. Omnicom's public messaging focused on growth, integration, and future capability, language clearly written with investors, analysts, and the financial press in mind, not to mention clients, polished, strategic, and familiar to anyone who has worked around holding companies. At the same time, a very different narrative was emerging elsewhere, particularly on LinkedIn and Reddit, driven by people inside the organization. People who had lost their jobs, and people watching colleagues lose theirs. That contrast became the focus of an Ad Age opinion piece by Elizabeth Rosenberg, a communications advisor who had handled large-scale change and layoffs herself. In the piece, which, by the way, Ad Age had unlocked the paywall, so it's openly available on their website. And later in her own LinkedIn posts, Rosenberg described watching two stories unfold in real time. One told to shareholders and external stakeholders, the other taking shape in comment threads written by the people most directly affected. Her point was not that Omnicom failed to communicate, but that it chose who to communicate to. That observation resonated widely inside the industry. Rosenberg's LinkedIn post made clear that she was less interested in being provocative than in naming something that many people were already seeing and feeling. She also noted the response she received privately, messages describing her comments as brave, and questioned what it says about our profession if plain speaking about human impact is now treated as courage. As that conversation gathered momentum, another LinkedIn post took the discussion in a slightly different direction. Stephanie Brown, a marketing career coach, wrote about the timing of the layoffs. Her post was grounded in personal experience. She describes being laid off herself in December 2013 and what it meant to lose a job during a period associated with family, financial pressure, and emotional strain. She acknowledged that layoffs are part of corporate life, but argued that timing is a choice and that announcing thousands of job losses immediately after Thanksgiving, with cuts landing before Christmas, intensified the impact. That post triggered a large and emotionally charged response, thousands of reactions, hundreds of comments. Some people echoed Brown's argument that holiday season layoffs carry an additional human cost. Others pushed back, arguing that earlier notice can be preferable to delayed disclosure, even if the timing is painful. What stood out was not consensus, but the depth of feeling and the willingness of people to share lived experience publicly. Across both posts and in the comment threads beneath them, a broader picture began to emerge. Former Omnicom and IPG employees described how they received the news. Industry veterans expressing sadness rather than surprise. Practitioners questioning what this says about internal credibility, culture, and leadership. Others pointing out that holding company economics have long prioritized shareholders and that this moment simply made that reality visible. What's notable here is that LinkedIn wasn't just a reaction channel. It became the place where the story itself evolved. The press release was no longer the primary narrative. The commentary, the responses, and the shared experiences became part of how the situation was understood. So that's the landscape we're stepping into today. A major communication holding company announcing significant layoffs, a formal investor-focused message, and a parallel highly visible conversation driven by employees, former employees, and industry peers about audience, timing, and impact. Rather than rushing to judgment, I think this is worth exploring carefully, especially for people whose job is communication, reputation, and trust. So, Shell, what would you say to all of this?
I would say, first of all, that for an organization that purports to be a communication organization, their failure to recognize that they employ thousands of communicators who know how to use publicly accessible channels is a massive failure in communication planning. It should have been anticipated. But the story is dripping with irony, Neville. In light of an article the Wall Street Journal published last week, the article pointed to an entirely different approach that companies are taking than the one Omnicom defaulted to. While Omnicom is watching its narrative get dismantled by its own employees on Reddit, the Wall Street Journal just reported that the hottest job in corporate America is, are you ready for this? Storyteller. Listings for jobs with storyteller in the title have doubled on LinkedIn in the past year. Executives used the word storytelling 469 times on earning calls through mid-December. Companies like Microsoft, Vanta, and USAA aren't just hiring communicators anymore. They're hunting for directors of storytelling and heads of narrative. Now, on one level, you can see why they're doing this. The journal points out that print newspapers' circulation has dropped 70% since 2005. The army of journalists we used to rely on to tell our stories has evaporated. And if companies want their news covered, they realize they have to become the media themselves. That's what Tom Feremsky said so many years ago. Every company's a media company. But what this really means is that the traditional gatekeepers are gone. But listening to what's happening with Omnicom, you have to wonder if these companies actually understand what storytelling means in 2025. We're seeing a collision of two worlds here. In one world, you have the C-suite still believing they can control the narrative by hiring better writers. They think if they can just recruit a customer storytelling manager, that's what Google's doing, or a former journalist to run corporate editorial, that's what Chime is doing, they can fill the void. They think they can craft a sanitized strategic message for investors, and that will be the story of record. Then you have the real world, Neville. It's the one you just described. While Omnicom was probably busy polishing its official investor-focused story, the actual story was being written in real time on Reddit and LinkedIn by the people living through the chaos. These employees didn't need a head of storytelling. They didn't need a corporate newsroom. They had the truth. They had a platform. This is exactly the loss of control we've been warning about for how many years? The journal quotes a communications CEO who says, leaders are finally realizing that brands are winning right now are the ones that are most authentic and human. Yeah, he's absolutely right. But here's the problem. You can't hire authenticity. If your new director of storytelling is busy writing a glossy piece about innovation while your employees are on social forums describing a culture of fear and disposal, you've lost the plot. The story isn't what you publish on your corporate blog. The story is what your people say it is. The journal notes that USAA's storyteller might work some real experiences into an executive speech. Yeah, that's fine. It's also table stakes. If Omnicom or any of these companies rushing to hire storytellers want to tell a better story, they don't need to hire better writers. They don't need to do just that. They need to give their employees a better story to tell. That's the idea behind employee advocacy, after all, isn't it? Because if the story you pay someone to write conflicts with the story your employees are living, employees are going to win every single time. And as we're seeing with Omnicom, they're going to do it on their own channels, and they're going to do it without anybody's approval.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ironies that came across in the story, according to both of the women I quoted from their LinkedIn posts, is that Omnicom and IPG have spent decades advising clients on authentic communication, yet failed to apply that themselves. Rosenberg highlights comments from laid-off staff, this is quite interesting, describing abrupt personal Zoom calls, minimal explanation of rationale or future direction, leadership absence at critical moments. These voices carried more weight than any press release because employees are the brand's most credible storytellers. Switch over to the town hall in early December, which Omnicom hosted, the first global company-wide town hall since the merger. It's really an acquisition. It was actually completed at the end of November. And the behavior of the CEO led me to think, just reading this, I hasten to add, I've not dived anywhere else to see what happened. Is he tone deaf, or does he just not care? Because one quote in one website that carried the story, Storyboard 18, says, opening the session, Florian Adamski, the CEO of Omnicom Media, reportedly addressed intense industry speculations surrounding the merger and restructuring. He criticized the tone of press and social media commentary, describing detractors as haters, and stressed that decisions have been taken after considerable deliberation, urging staff to stay patient as transitions rolled out. And it goes on elsewhere in this piece to repeat that call from the leadership of Omnicom to be patient, everyone, it's all going to be fine, but without any communication explaining how, or worse, I think, even addressing the detail of what people have been saying about this. Is that tone deaf or what? I don't know.
Seriously tone deaf. I remember years and years ago, this was at a Reagan conference in Chicago, and a CEO was speaking. I think he was the CEO of Avon, the cosmetic company that does, or at least they used to do door-to-door sales. Avon calling used to be their tagline, because you'd hear the doorbell ring. Anyway, he made the point that he thinks that CEOs, the minute they are installed in that role and sit in the CEO's chair, there is a stupid ray aimed at them that affects their brains and makes them forget who employees are. He made a point at least once a month of visiting frontline employees. It could be at a location where, say, a manufacturing facility where they were filling bottles with the solutions that they sold. But he talked to them to remind himself that these are real people, that they have real lives, and that they are smarter than you tend to give them credit for when you don't interact with them at all. You're the CEO, you're part of the executive team, and those are the little people down there doing all the work, and they're not smart enough to absorb bad news, right? And, he, in speaking to them, found that they were scoutmasters and that they helped their spouses run businesses and that they were the president of the local Kiwanis club and things like this, and that they are smart and that they can handle bad news, that they can understand things like business plans and corporate strategy. And I think in this case, the CEO, I don't remember his name, but he obviously has not moved himself out of the path of that stupid ray, because his assessment of employees and the role they could play in this was seriously misguided.
Yeah, I mean, your mention of that phrase, "the little people," reminded me of that woman, that hotel owner in New York who went to jail, I think, for not paying taxes because she says only the little people pay taxes. She doesn't have to. That was her defense.
That was Leona Hemsley. That's right.
That's it. There was a kind of a by the way to this. But so one thing I also I thought when I was kind of thinking myself about this story, the optics are bad, but this isn't about the optics. It's about trust, right? So to me, it's like this happened. 4,000 people losing their jobs, or whatever the legal terms are. It's the jobs that are eliminated, not the people. Yeah, they're losing their jobs right before Christmas, and it's going to be extremely painful to many of them. They feel angry. So the deeper risk is long-term erosion of trust in Omnicom, I would say. Employees disengage or leave faster, the ones who are still there. Leadership messages lose credibility. Organizational resilience weakens, and clients notice the inconsistency between advice given and the behavior they're showing. So this gap, well, it's damaging, right? The other thing to mention, and it really kind of confirms the point you made earlier, in a world where every employee has a public platform like this, organizations do not control the narrative. I mean, will be obvious to you and me, but this sets it quite clearly. The story that endures, and this is the key thing here, the lasting story is how people remember being treated when change was unavoidable. And it's hard, you can't actually predict what effects that's actually going to have on Omnicom. And it may well be that in this age of polarization and utter cynicism, no one will care about this when they get hired and go and work for Omnicom, about the 4,000 people who got fired the way they did. So it's nevertheless, this is, you couldn't say, hey, this is a firm that has best practices in all its operating. It does not. This is a firm that I wouldn't like to work for based on this, and it wouldn't just be this. I mean, I started my working career in advertising at J. Walter Thompson back in the late 70s, and Omnicom's got a storied history in its current form. The legacy brands that they keep talking about in the press releases that are all being retired. I wonder how that's been explained to employees, but these so-called legacy brands that have been around for decades. Doyle Dane Bernbach, BBDO, some of these firms have been around. They were around when I was at JWT all those years ago. It kind of partly why I wanted to talk about this, because it kind of reminds me that nothing is permanent, that the gloss in advertising is often just literally a veneer. This is a veneer on top of Omnicom. I think they will not gain any credit for this, I don't believe. And the CEO's reaction, just according to that town hall write-up, pretty appalling, I think.
It's just terrible. And as we know, because we report on it every year, employees are still the most trusted source from a company, according to the Edelman Trust Barometer. And when you have this many employees out talking about what happened to them, telling their stories authentically, that's what people are going to remember. They're not going to remember the financial forecast that Omnicom has put forward as a result of its business moves. And, it's the CEO, somebody needs to counsel this guy. I read somewhere that even the layoff notification that he was supposed to participate in, they said, he can't because he's having technical difficulties. I mean, come on, really? You're not even going to get that personal message of regret from the leader of the organization? That couldn't have helped. We're in a period right now where people are struggling to find jobs in communication. And if Omnicom opens some jobs, and it's not unusual for a company that has laid off a bunch of people to also have job openings to fill specific roles, people will take those jobs because it's hard to find one right now. But if that pendulum swings and it becomes the seller's market rather than the buyer's market again, I can't imagine a lot of communicators who are going to want to go work there, especially after they get their financial footing and end up experiencing some growth and need to hire. They may find themselves hiring a more mediocre workforce because the best of the best are going to say, no, I'm really good. The world knows I'm good. I can work anywhere. I'm not going to go work for those jerks.
No, I think it's a good point you're making there. Another thing to mention, I think, is what I referenced earlier, that I was surprised to see the comments on Reddit, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, in a way I wasn't expecting. I expect to see a lot of ranting, a lot of ugliness, a lot of pushback, perhaps, and maybe trolling, all that. Didn't see much of that. I saw what I would describe as sheer sadness by many people, calm acceptance of the awfulness of it all by those who've been fired, and they're in there commenting. Also, the two LinkedIn posts that I've discussed here, very much worth looking at those and the comments in those posts. And there's some things to learn from that. But I think the I don't know, it's not really a conclusion, but layoffs are inevitable, and indeed in the case of this acquisition, they were inevitable. But the flip of that, the communication failure was not inevitable if they had handled it differently or better. Employees now shape the public narrative in real time, just reinforce that point. Trust, once lost, quickly becomes an external issue, which is what we're seeing playing out still. And communication principles, just get that on the table, apply most when it's hardest to use them, like this situation. And I think they failed the test totally, this company.
Yeah, I'll tell you what. We just recently completed an acquisition here where I work, and in our little 2-person communication team, in our small $1.5 billion company, the communication was far superior to what we see coming out of this behemoth of a communication organization. It's pathetic. And they really, this is what Zuckerberg always said when he got caught doing something bad. It was, we'll have to do better. Of course, he never does. And I doubt that Omnicom will either, based on this behavior, but they need to do better. And that'll be a 30 for this episode of For Immediate Release.